The beacon was ancient, not because of age, because of desperation. Built from scavenged parts and forbidden tech, it pulsed like a heartbeat out into a cold, uncaring galaxy. The Erixi weren't warriors. They weren't expansionists. They built star maps, composed harmonics from solar winds, archived extinct languages in memory crystals. And now, they were burning. The Vorkai had torn through their outer moons, not to conquer, to erase. Predators with religion, believing themselves chosen to purify the weak from existence. The Erixi had no fleets, no soldiers, just knowledge. So they sent a signal. To anyone, everyone. The Galactic Council received it and ignored it. Too distant, they said, too dangerous, too irrelevant. Strategic value, minimal. That was the last official notation in the Council archive. Still, the beacon pulsed. Every 8 seconds, one more cry, one more hope, a whisper against extinction. On the final night, when the sky above their last continent cracked with the arrival of orbital fire, the High Archivist, herself bloodied and breathless, placed her trembling hand on the console. "Send again," they begged the void, and as the towers collapsed, as history turned to ash, one final reply came. Short, obsolete protocol, dead format, one word, received. The signal was Terran. The language, Earth Standard. Galactic systems stuttered. Military networks froze. Because Earth was gone. Wasn't it? Earth had fallen silent 500 years ago, lost to internal collapse, ecological ruin, and war among its own colonies. No verified signal, no surviving envoy, no diplomatic presence. It had become a name whispered in archives, a warning, a myth. The last known record was a broadcast of static, followed by coordinates marked "Do Not Approach." And yet, here it was. Terran, clear, unmistakable. Analysts rechecked their systems, thought it a trick, a corrupted loop. But the pulse repeated, not automated, not random. It was deliberate, timed to their distress. One counselor whispered, "Could they have hidden?" Another replied, "Or did something else survive in their place?" The Erixi couldn't know. They had no time left. They only heard the signal, saw the frequency lock, and in that final moment, they allowed themselves a thought they had no right to hold. That someone heard them, that someone would come. They didn't know who or what. Only this, the silence was broken, and sometimes the scariest response in the galaxy is the one you didn't expect. Because when Terrans reply, history doesn't repeat. It recoils. The beacon was still transmitting when the skies turned to glass. But in deep space, aboard an unregistered black hull vessel without IFF tags, a man looked up from an old analog console, smiled quietly and said, "Guess it's time again." He flipped a switch labeled "Old Fire" and leaned back in his chair. Somewhere deep in his bones, something older than war remembered what came next. Not vengeance, correction. And across the stars, the word echoed again, now bouncing off relay satellites long dormant. Received. The signal had been sent. The last of the Erixi cities were falling, and now they waited. Not for rescue, but for the end. Except something answered. The scholars remembered the old stories. Whispers, really. Myths of the Deathworlders. Creatures born from pain, forged by gravity, sharpened by time. A species that evolved on a blue world full of shifting tectonics, acid rains, magnetic storms, and apex predators so savage they had their own extinction cycles. Humans, Earthborn. But Earth had fallen centuries ago. It was a grave name spoken in scientific literature and war manuals, often footnoted with one word, lost. Yet the reply had been Terran, and now something was arriving. It began with a flicker in Erixi orbital sensors, too high to be ships, too irregular to be debris, just shadows, flickering. Then silence. The satellites didn't explode. They didn't malfunction. They stopped reporting, not destroyed, overwritten. Erixi engineers stared at blank screens, praying for data, even corrupted signals. Nothing came, only cold. Then a pulse, low, rhythmic. Not a weapon, a countdown. Some recognized it. Primitive, ancient, binary, old Terran formatting. A woman whispered in horror, "They're talking to our machines." Not through translation, through understanding. The pulse changed, the clouds shifted. Something enormous entered orbit. No standard propulsion, no known signal, no configuration the archives could classify. Not metal, not organic. Something in between. Alive? Evolved? The Erixi Chancellor asked, trembling. What species registers a null radiation signature during descent? No one had an answer, but the myths did. The Deathworlders never fought for power, they fought for meaning, and when they stopped appearing in the stars, no one dared go looking. Because what lives on the edge of extinction doesn't need to conquer. It just needs to endure. And now it was here, not to make contact, to correct what the galaxy had allowed. The first visual came through a ground-based telescope, a silhouette, humanoid, stepping out of a descending void like it had always belonged there. It didn't glow, it didn't roar, it simply arrived. Vorkai command relays picked up faint signals and fell quiet. No alarms, just system resets and unreadable telemetry. Erixi minds trained in science, not superstition, could only watch as logic began to fail. One researcher muttered, "It's not cloaking, it's not distortion, it's displacement, like it chooses what can perceive it." Then came the first resonance. Not language, not sound, just memory, pushed into every mind tuned into the old Terran signal. A battlefield of mud, a child's drawing on rubble, a hand reaching into fire, not for glory, but for someone else's survival. The Erixi wept, not from fear, from recognition. This was no army, this was no savior. This was something older, something that remembered what the galaxy wanted to forget. And as the shadows above folded into clouds, a final line appeared across every display, every shattered panel, every broken crystal. We are the silence between wars. We are the breath before the scream. We are what you called gone. And then, the first Vorkai warship exploded from the inside out. Not from attack, from rejection. Like the universe itself denied it permission to exist any longer. The Erixi watched as the impossible stepped into view, wearing a face no one remembered and eyes that had seen too much. And in that moment, the myths were rewritten, not as legend, but as warning, because the Deathworlders didn't die. They just got quiet. At 0400 local orbital time, the Erixi sky tore open, not in flame, not in thunder, but in stillness. A hyperspace breach, yet no corridor shimmered, no ripple of warp light. Instead, the stars blinked. Once, then one simply did not return. Something arrived. Not a fleet, a single entity. Massive, silent, black hull interlaced with organic geometry, curved like bone, smooth like obsidian. It seemed not built, but grown. It moved without propulsion, hung without thrust. Its presence did not register on active scans, only on passive ones. And even then, it was as if the universe was unsure how to describe it. The Vorkai, arrogant as ever, declared it a bluff, a trick. They fired first. 4 cruisers launched plasma salvos, gravity torpedoes, even neutron distorters. None of them landed. They simply vanished. The ship did not fire back. Instead, the planet screamed. Every radio band, every magnetic line, even the ionosphere pulsed like a struck drum. The air grew heavy, then blinding, then still. The Vorkai vessels went blind, then mute, then gone. No explosion, no wreckage, just absence. Sensors couldn't find them. Memory couldn't hold them, like the universe erased them out of politeness. The Erixi watched in stunned silence. The ship did not hail, did not identify. Its presence was not political, it was principled. Its hull bore one mark, not a language, not a warning, just a shape, a spiral intersecting a broken ring, a symbol not found in any known archive. But one Erixi elder whispered, "I saw it once, in a pre-glass Terran diagram. They called it null return." Then a sound, Software harmonic. Like an old Terran choir tuning up in deep vacuum. The Erixi fell to their knees, not in fear, in comprehension. This was no warship. This was a verdict. It hovered above the atmosphere, but every ocean began to vibrate with its presence. Not because of propulsion, but because gravity remembered something older than law. No system is perfect, he said. On the fourth night, she baited him, told him he smelled of weak meat and unwashed fear. He chuckled. I've smelled worse, he said, sipping his coffee. On the fifth, she approached him wearing full Varn ceremonial armor, gleaming and intimidating, claws resting on the hilt of a training blade. He nodded once. You look like yourself again. He didn't flinch. By the sixth day, she had run out of weapons, so she turned to books. Human archives were vast, emotionally chaotic, but rich. Poets wrote of sorrow and glory in the same breath. Soldiers wept for enemies they had slain. Scientists debated not what they could build, but whether they should. She learned of their wars, their betrayals, their endless rebuilding. Humans forgive, she muttered one night, eyes scanning through the files. But never forget. The translator whispered the phrase into her thoughts, soft and exact. On the seventh day, as Dane stood alone at the viewport, sipping from a tin cup and watching a drifting nebula, she approached quietly. He didn't turn. Askira studied him, her voice finally steady, finally willing. Why didn't you laugh? He didn't move, didn't even blink. Because you're not a joke, he said, and I don't need an audience to know what matters. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of gravity, of shifting things unspoken. She sat beside him, careful not to touch, but close enough that the silence would have to make room for two. That night she didn't sleep, not because she feared betrayal, but because for the first time in her life, she couldn't predict the end of the story. They watched her. From the moment Askira remained aboard the Terran vessel, the Varn Dominion sent watchers, cloaked transmissions, embedded algorithms, whispered demands through compromised channels. Some messages offered redemption, others threatened annihilation. None moved her. At first, she ignored the Terran Council's intelligence briefings. Then one day she didn't. She walked into the strategy chamber, wearing Terran black, her data tablet tucked under one arm, and without a word uploaded 4 files. Fleet routes, outdated but real. Varn refueling protocols, a list of compromised relay buoys. The room froze. Dane was there. He didn't question her. He just said, "Thank you." It was Earth's intelligence minister, a graying woman with sharp eyes, who asked, "Should we treat this as a defection?" Askira met her gaze without blinking. "Treat it as truth." She walked out before they could respond. That night, the Varn sent a direct message, a hologram flickering into life in the privacy of her quarters. "Return," the voice hissed. "This charade ends now. You dishonor your blood." Askira leaned in, unblinking. "I make my own name now." Then she deleted the channel and blocked its frequency from the entire ship. From that day on, the Terran Council stopped asking if she was a spy, because she wasn't. She was theirs. The shift wasn't sudden. It came in soft steps. Meals shared between battle reports. Askira learned to appreciate Terran coffee, though she took it without cream or sweetness, declaring sugar to be a weapon. Dane laughed the first time she said it. She tilted her head at the sound. "Why do you do that?" she'd asked. "Do what?" "That sound, that noise." "You mean laugh?" "Yes, it's unsettling. It's supposed to be." Askira blinked. "Then why use it?" "Because sometimes," he said, leaning back in his chair, "the only way to stop from breaking is to laugh first." Askira didn't understand it then, but weeks later, during a failed diplomatic summit with a blustering aquatic envoy who called humans barely vertebrate, she made the sound. A single dry hectare. Dane nearly choked on his coffee. Their conversations became longer, stranger. Askira taught Dane to pronounce the sharp inflections of the Varn tongue. Not the guttural dialect used in war, but the ancient speech of philosophers and poets. He fumbled through it, each misstep a new opportunity for her to smirk. Not laugh, not yet, but the smirk was new and real. In exchange, he read to her from Earth's archives, Kipling, Angelo, old poems from dead worlds. She was especially quiet after hearing, "If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same." "That," she said finally, "is a warrior's creed." Dane nodded. "And a survivor's." The bond was never spoken. No declarations, no touching, no vows. But when Dane collapsed from a blood infection, brought back from a lunar scouting mission, Askira sat by his bed for 3 days. She read his own mission logs aloud to him. Not for his sake, he was unconscious, but to remind herself of what mattered. He awoke to her voice reciting a Terran poem in broken cadence. "I thought I was dreaming," he said hoarsely. "You were," she replied, "but I stayed anyway." Lightning struck clear skies. Children began to hum without knowing why. The Vorkai tried again, launching a dreadnought with enough power to crack a moon. It never arrived. The dreadnought's log ended mid-word. In its place, only silence, and a faint echo of the word, "begin." Arixi signal interpreters tried to localize the phrase's source. It didn't come from the ship. It came from the planet. The very crust of the world resonated with it, like Earth remembered, and something answered. Inside Council databanks, emergency access keys began rewriting themselves, opening files last touched in the Sol Wars. Files marked "Do Not Awaken." Somewhere far above, ancient satellites, long thought to be debris, aligned themselves in a spiral pattern, then blinked once and fell inert. On the surface, a child spoke the ship's name in her sleep, a name no one taught her, in a dialect no one used anymore. She called it the second silence, and it made sense to no one, but felt true to everyone. The ship began to descend, not to land, to look. The Vorkai prepared to flee, but their coordinates were gone, not jammed, deleted from local space. They were nowhere now, and the Arixi finally understood. This wasn't vengeance. This wasn't justice. This was the arrival of memory, with purpose, and all it took was one answered signal. Galactic Command scrambled. Within 2 hours of the Arixi signal breach, half a dozen sensor arrays on fringe colonies blinked with false data, before correcting themselves a second later. But the disturbance was too precise to ignore. Something had moved between systems without using known lanes, without tearing space. It simply passed. Commanders called emergency summits. Protocols from 5 centuries ago were unearthed, some written in languages no one spoke anymore. The Terran markers were clear. A Deathworlder-class vessel had moved through open star space. The last recorded incident was 713 years prior, during the glass collapse of Theta Aurigae. That time it had ended with a planet vanishing, not destroyed, removed. The archives were incomplete, some corrupted, some locked behind sovereign-level encryption. But one entry remained, perfectly intact. 3 sentences, no metadata, just bold text. "Do not provoke, do not follow, do not lie." A shiver passed through every council delegate. Some called for emissaries, others called for weapons. One old veteran, face lined with cyber scars and half a lung replaced with vacuum stabilizers, said quietly, "They do not come to negotiate." Still, the ship said nothing. It held position over Arixi Prime, unmoving. No signals, no lights, just orbit. Watching, waiting, judging. It made no demands. It issued no threats. It didn't need to. Command ships sent scans. They returned gibberish, like the data changed mid-transmission to confuse interpretation. Psychic probes returned only feedback loops. Echoes of the probe's own thoughts scrambled. A diplomat asked, "What do they want?" No one answered, because the more pressing question became, what had they already decided? On distant relay stations, ancient proximity failsafes activated, once designed to detect early Terran drift signatures. None had triggered in centuries. All of them now blinked in sync. A council technician found a file nested inside an old comms buffer. It simply read, "Your time of observation begins now." The technician quit on the spot. The council considered issuing a broadcast, a declaration of sovereignty, or at least peace. But every AI strategist returned the same result. 0% success rate. not due to risk of war, but the futility of words, because the ship wasn't waiting for speech. It was waiting for honesty, and history had too many lies. The more silence it kept, the louder the galaxy's guilt became. Planets with buried secrets scrubbed local logs. Outposts shut down tracking stations, hoping to pretend they saw nothing. But the ship remained, above the galaxy, and beyond them, everywhere. One child looked through a telescope and said, "It's looking at me." When asked what it wanted, she answered, "To remember what we forgot." And on one forgotten moon, an abandoned temple long sealed by war, lit up from within. Its floor showed a Terran map, etched in stone, labeled with a single phrase in old dialect: "Let those who forget be reminded." The Erexi, desperate for understanding, launched a final set of low-impact drones. Non-invasive, silent, slow. The moment the first reached proximity of the Deathworlder ship, it stopped. Not destroyed, not jammed. Acknowledged. The ship didn't raise shields. It didn't redirect. Instead, it opened. Just a sliver. Enough to allow one transmission, visual only. No sound. The Erixi prepared for threat display, military dominance. Perhaps a demand or warning. But what came through was Earth. Not as remembered in archives. As it is now. Ash-blown skies. Oceans blackened by time and orbit fall. Cities carved into scarred Earth, overgrown with vines that refused to die. Craters where continents used to be. But green remained. Somehow, defiantly. Life still bloomed. Not because of preservation, but because of refusal. Refusal to die. Above the broken planet floated something more staggering. A fleet. Massive. Thousands of ships. Not uniform, not a navy. More like a migration. Old vessels retrofitted with biological cores. Satellite husks bonded to Sportech hulls. Solar rigs guided by instinct rather than code. Each bore the same insignia. A fractured circle, surrounded by hundreds of unique species symbols. A coalition of survivors. And at the heart, human design. Not imperial, not dominant. Just central. As if everything had come home to orbit the one world that never truly left them. The visual lingered on one frame. A child, Erixi by descent, standing in a Terran field, holding hands with a human elder. Behind them, hybrid shelters, shared farms, no weapons, just rebuilding. Then a phrase etched into the bottom of the feed. "We heard you." The feed shifted again. Not command symbols, not military formations, but names. Worlds the galaxy had failed, peoples ignored, cultures erased in silence. Each one now carved onto the sides of those Terran-born ships. Erixi was there too, scrawled not in ceremony, but in memory. And the Arixi watching realized they had never been abandoned, just unheard. Then came the final frame. The Earth faded from view. In its place, stars. And a line that pulsed through every frequency, from ancient analog to modern weave. We do not answer to politics, we answer to pain. The transmission ended. No follow-up, no ultimatum, just stillness. But now the galaxy wasn't afraid of what the Deathworlders would do. They were afraid of what they'd remembered. Because when you survive the worst, you don't forget those who cried out. You become the echo. The Vorkai did what predators always do when their prey resists. They attacked. Not a raid, not a skirmish, an all-out strike. 10 carriers, dozens of cruisers, planetfall troops bred for fear and fury. Erixi Prime lit up with descending flame. They had no hope of defense, no military worth noting. Their culture, one of thought and study, had no claws. They braced for extinction. Again. But the sky had learned to lie. Because just as the first drop ships burned into Atmo, the air tore open. No warning, no preamble. The same hyperspace silence. But now, more. Not one ship. Hundreds. They didn't descend like defenders. They moved like instruments. Silhouettes drawn sharp and black, like surgical knives dragged from the void. They did not broadcast. They did not warn. They reacted. Light moved wrong around them. Vorkai targeting systems failed mid-lock. Engines sputtered in proximity. Then, nothing. No screams. No flame. Just ship after ship disassembled in midair. Some flickered out like shadows forgetting to be cast. Others inverted and folded in on themselves, displaced to somewhere else, somewhere not here. The Deathworlder fleet didn't land. They didn't garrison. They didn't speak. They acted. And the battlefield was reduced to a silence so deep, even morning had no voice. Within 22 minutes, the Vorkai strike force no longer existed. Not disabled, not repelled. Gone. The Erixi waited for the other blade. Occupation, reprimand, debt. But nothing came, except a sound. Not through radios, not through ears, through mind. A presence, not invasive, not foreign. Warm, deep, like memory whispered from a dream you forgot you needed. 7 words, spoken in every tongue at once. You are not alone, not this time. The Erexi elders wept, not from grief but from disbelief. They had written poems about mercy. Now they saw it shaped in fireless war. One child clutched a flower that hadn't bloomed in years. It opened the moment the ships appeared. In orbit, the Deathworlders remained, quiet, fixed. The council tried to contact them. No reply. Some Vorkai survivors in hidden frigates watched the slaughter and turned their ships toward the edges of known space. Their war was over. Their myth, broken. And in the silent forests of Erixi Prime, the wind moved like a breath of peace. Monuments were never built to the Deathworlders. They didn't stay long enough, but the stars remembered, and the children did too. A generation later, their songs began with a new word for hope, Terra, not as a place, but as a promise. Records began to surface. First a trickle, then a flood. Dusty files, lost archives, data logs hidden beneath bureaucratic decay, whispers from forgotten places. The Deathworlders, it turned out, had not been idle in the centuries since their disappearance. They had wandered, quietly, carefully, watching. Old species began to speak, tentatively at first, then with reverence. The Olorans said their people were once plagued by atmosphere-feeding parasites. No cure, no hope. Until a ship appeared, hovering for 1 day and 1 night. The next morning, every parasite was gone. No communication, no contact, just clean air and silence. The Lorani spoke of a moonquake that buried their entire skyport. Rescue was deemed impossible, but something tunneled from below, cutting a perfect spiral out of the rock, and left them a new city. No explanation, no insignia. Only a message left in encoded mineral patterns. Hold the line. We heard you. And on it went. Species who thought they'd survive by luck. Now realizing it wasn't luck at all. It was legacy. It was the remnants of a species who had once chosen to protect rather than dominate. The Deathworlders had become ghosts, not of fear, of promise. And they never stopped listening. An old empire, one that had once warred with Terra, sought to re-engage. They sent an envoy, a ship of silken design and honeyed words, ready to spin new treaties. 48 hours later, that ship was found. Not destroyed, not breached, empty. Floating gently above a gas giant's rings. Every panel, every wall, every console, every floor, engraved, not with warnings, not with demands, but with a single sentence. Never let them cry alone. No signs of violence. No signs of fear, just silence, and an impossible stillness, as if the ship itself had been paused in thought. The council reviewed the engraving over and over, translating it in over 400 dialects. The phrase remained unchanged. Empires that once prided themselves on diplomacy said nothing, because this wasn't politics. This was a memory that had refused to die, a promise kept so deeply it had become instinct. And now the galaxy was left with only one conclusion. The Deathworlders had never vanished. They had just grown tired of warning us. They waited for a reason to return. And mercy year was enough. Some called them guardians, others echoes. But the Erixi called them something else. Not saviors, not soldiers, but listeners. And in a universe of power measured by who speaks loudest, the loudest power of all was the one who heard you and came. The vote passed in silence. The Galactic Council, shaken and embarrassed, moved quickly. They banned Earth technology, prohibited all contact with Terra-descended systems, closed diplomatic channels. The language of the ruling was sterile, cold, but the reason was simple: fear. Because the Deathworlders hadn't demanded anything. They hadn't responded to queries. They hadn't claimed territory. They had just moved. And the galaxy couldn't track them. The fleet didn't operate by Empire logic. It moved like wind across a dying fire. No central command, no broadcast frequencies, just intention. And wherever injustice flared, it snuffed out. A slavery ring on the rim vanished overnight, found empty with no bodies, just a field of handprints etched into steel walls. A bioweapons lab hidden inside a neutron star's corona was suddenly offline, its scientists missing, its test subjects freed and relocated across protected worlds. Not fire, judgment. The Deathworlders were everywhere, and nowhere. They left no signatures, only outcomes. One by one, old tyrannies toppled. No declarations, no battles, just silence, and then absence. They did not rewrite laws. They removed the ones who broke them. And when council enforcement ships tried to follow, they vanished too, but not dead, returned, with no memory of what happened. But each officer reported hearing a voice, calm, human, unyielding. You knew. You let it happen. But now, it stops. Galactic sectors began to whisper. The unheard war, they called it. A war not of explosions or occupation, but erasure. Mercy wielded as justice. And through it all, across every encounter, one phrase repeated: you called. We answered. On Erixi Prime, flowers bloomed again. Libraries once burned were rebuilt, not by Deathworlder hand, but by Erixi will. They were not ruled. They were protected. And they remembered the moment it all changed. Not when the Vorkai invaded, not when the ships arrived, but when someone answered their cry. And now, they pass that memory forward. In music, in math, in murals drawn by children who never knew fear. And in the stars above them, moving just beyond sight, the fleet listened. Always. Humanity had never left. They just waited. Waited for the moment when words were no longer enough. Waited for mercy to fail. And when it did, they came. Some leaders called for retaliation. Others called for surrender. None were heard, because you can't negotiate with silence. You can only choose whether to earn it or be erased by it. Academies rewrote ethics classes. They studied restraint as a weapon, how the absence of wrath can destabilize tyrants more than bombs. A small moon once used for gladiator games woke to find its arenas filled with vines and soft white flowers. Every cage door welded open. No one saw it happen. No one tried to fix it, because the people knew. This was not a threat. It was a warning. One species learned this lesson too late. The Civil Dominion broadcasted defiance. They mocked the Deathworlders, dared them to intervene. Their transmission ended with static. Static that hummed, then whispered, "This isn't punishment, it's prevention." From then on, fewer dared to cry power. More dared to whisper hope. They no longer worshipped Earth. They aligned with its memory, its myth. Because myths don't need to be seen. They only need to be believed. And the greatest myths: walk quietly, carry nothing but choice, and never forget who called first. Humanity didn't come to lead. They came to listen, to lift, to remember what even the stars tried to forget. That the strongest power in the galaxy was not domination. It was a hand unshackling another, without being asked, without expecting reward, just because they could. That was the unheard war, not of guns, of grace. And though no one ever saw the Deathworlders again, the galaxy no longer slept the same way. Because now, when distress calls went out, they were answered, always. One in particular, a Skira, standing tall, cloak over her shoulders, not draped by chains, not tossed aside in mockery, but folded with dignity, Eyes forward, shoulders squared, not holding a weapon, holding nothing at all, because she needed nothing more. The caption beneath read, "She stood, so we could walk." Dane never asked for a statue, never wanted one. He preferred smaller things, teaching navigation systems to younger pilots, writing essays no one read about diplomacy through silence. He didn't need to be seen. But one statue did rise beside Askira, smaller, not of him, of Saris, 11 years old. Hair pulled back, tunic simple, boots planted evenly on the carved stone. In her hand, a scroll. Carved into it, a title, Legacy of the Laugh. When Sarah saw it for the first time, she tilted her head. "Why that name?" she asked the sculptor. The woman smiled. "Because your life began with a laugh they thought was impossible." Saris ran her fingers along the etched letters. "They tried to make a joke out of you," the sculptor added. Saris nodded. "And we became the punchline they couldn't escape." Not all Varn agreed with the changes, but even those who clenched their teeth couldn't deny the new reality. Trade stabilized, piracy declined, borders held, and peace, once a performance, began to feel like truth. On the anniversary of the original gift, a new tradition emerged. Across Accord systems, hybrid children were invited to speak. Not rehearsed, not scripted, just speak. One child asked a crowd, "What if we're not the future, but the reset?" Another replied, "Maybe we're both." Saris listened from the crowd that day. No podium, no spotlight. She smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was happening. On the edge of known space, an elderly Varn priest wrote a final passage before sealing his scroll. "Once we tried to mock a people we did not understand. We gave them what we thought was shame. They gave us what we never saw coming, forgiveness and a mirror." The galaxy did not become utopia, but it became something rarer, aware of its scars, of its stories, of its shared breath. Children like Saris walked freely now, not as symbols, but as students, diplomats, explorers. They held scrolls instead of swords, names instead of numbers, voices instead of orders. And behind them always was the memory of two people who never asked for history. They just refused to be erased by it. And so the joke ended, not with a punchline, but with a dynasty, not of blood, of belief,